Well, hello and welcome to this very special session on accessibility for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is actually today. My name is Jaslyn and I'm the Global Manager for Customer Value Design at OpenLMS, and I have with me James Smith, our Senior Customer Solutions Architect. We're going to share with you today some information and tips about accessibility in our learning environments. So take us away, James.
Yeah, thanks, Jazz, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Accessibility, it is actually great to be doing this on a day that is set aside for accessibility awareness. We don't often get the opportunity to talk about things on a day when everybody has, a focus on that particular subject. But I guess the only negative on that is I don't want anyone to think that that's the only day we need to think about accessibility. So with that aside, I'm sure that's not true that any of us would. But we just want to talk about a few things today. There is so much in accessibility, the built environment, the digital environment, and so on. So we're going to try and focus this down to, our area of knowledge and expertise. But we've all probably come across things, in all facets of our lives that can have an accessibility layer or lens laid upon it. So we'll talk today a little bit about what accessibility means, and that's from our perspective. We certainly are not experts. I think people who are experts in accessibility are probably the people who require accessibility or have experienced the hurdles. We just like to think that we're open-minded and like to listen and respond to any issues that people have, and that we provide a product that does meet most of the standards that are available out there. And we'll go into a little bit of why accessibility is important. Some of it's obvious and some of it isn't. And accessibility in our products, because this is where our standpoint is coming from, but it does illustrate what else we can do, in the rest of the world, and especially the digital world. We're not really concentrating on the built world, but the built world's a good example as well. And then just maybe these are more opinions, but working towards accessibility as a status quo, as opposed to just something you have to do as well as whatever else you do in your day-to-day work. So if we go to the next one. So what does accessibility mean? There's a lot of words on a page. I'm not going to read them all out. I don't read PowerPoint slides out. We can provide these afterwards. But I like to focus on the idea that accessibility means that anybody with any level of ability, impairment, disability, whatever we're talking about, can independently access what it is we've created. So if we talk about that in a learning environment, anybody can go through that learning experience and gain the knowledge and skills that we are trying to convey in that learning experience. And I'll come back to the word independently because I capitalized it in this slide. To me, that's the most important word here. They shouldn't have to put their hand up and say, can I have a different version of this content? So the next slide kind of goes into that a little bit too, like why is accessibility important? Nobody wants to be in a position where they turn up to a learning experience and go, I can't experience what everybody else in the room or online is experiencing. So I'm going to come back to that independently word again, if they can independently access it, because we can use screen readers and all these sorts of other things. And yes, they are great tools, but let's try and work towards a world where they are not as required. They might always be required a little bit, but not as required. And I guess the term would be, creating a level playing field for everybody, metaphorically speaking, of course. Next one. So last year, this number said 15%. So it's either that the figures are being calibrated better, or we are seeing more people identifying with impairments and disabilities, whether they're acquiring them or not. But the point is that when we're certainly not catering to people in 16% of the population for the needs that they have. We might be catering to certain fairly visible requirements that are a bit more obvious and easy to cater to. But I actually found another figure just before this, that there's this consortium called WebAIM, and they independently analyze websites and things like that. So I know we're not talking about websites, but websites are everywhere. Everyone has a website. And there was a figure that 98% of homepages had WCAG or WCAG failures in them, so errors in them. 98% of it just it doesn't mean that they
blows my mind.
Yeah, it doesn't mean the sites crashed or they were completely unreadable, but there was an element in there somewhere that defied the broad idea of what accessibility means. And point 9, average number of errors per homepage. Because code obviously has lots of lines in it, so there were issues with things like screen readers, where one line of code might have pushed a screen reader into an illogical step rather than a logical step for someone who maybe have a sight impairment or a cognitive impairment. So these are just interesting figures to throw out there, because I know a lot of us looking at this may not have any of these impairments, but we need to be putting ourselves in the shoes of these people who may experience these impairments. And it's very difficult to do so when you don't experience them yourself.
Yes.
And that's what this is all about. It's what our personal abilities are, define our sense of what's normal, but also our personal environment. So if I've got a guy with a wheelchair in my team, then I'm going to be a lot more conscious of it than someone who doesn't have someone with a wheelchair in their team, or someone with a motor neurone issue who can't use a mouse properly, or something like that. So it's almost like, and it's terrible to say, it's a majority rules or a status quo rules, because we're used to doing things in a particular way. We're in the habit of creating some kind of an alternative for people who cannot access what it is we create, which makes them the other. They're always going to be the other.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, the zone of normal, which is just, it sounds awful really when you think about it. What's the zone of normal? Oh, you're not normal, so I'm not designing for you. I mean, that could be the context that some of us have when it's a bit too hard, right? We're not mean, we're not awful people, but we're trying to get our job done in a time frame and to a budget and things like that. And the zone of normal feels like it's easier and it's more on budget and so on. Now, we've thrown this next one in here just to show a little bit about the bitter irony of what happens on a daily basis. This is around the built environment, but I think it conveys very interestingly the message. Now, this guy, Nipun Malhotra, he is a social entrepreneur and disability rights activist. He was asked to speak at the 2019 Expo on Smart Cities in India. And they had this centerpiece around accessibility. So as he approached the stage to go up and speak, what are you noticing here?
Right. You're not going to be able to get a wheelchair up a flight of stairs.
Yeah. So, the guy who was invited to come and talk about this stuff couldn't get up onto the stage. Now, I'll just leave that there. I mean, that speaks for itself, I think. But how many times do we do these things because our zone of normal is not including, some people who may be in the smaller percentage of the population or the fringe, but we'll certainly hear about it because this guy has a big following and he is an advocate and an entrepreneur. So he puts it on Twitter. It's still on Twitter and it's still getting shared to this day. And it was in 2019.
Yeah. It has a big impact.
Yeah. Having said that, the irony of that is we disproportionately focus on observable impairments. So Mr. Malhotra has an observable impairment and we still left him out when it came to that environment. It's not going to be the typical, but it only needs to happen once for it to hit the front page or Twitter or wherever else 1 billion people can go and have a look at it and see how bad we are. So, even if it's just about PR, we need to avoid these kinds of things as much as possible. But it is shown that we still disproportionately focus on the observable impairments because they're observable. People don't have to put up their hand and say, I'm colorblind, or I'm in a wheelchair. They would have to say they're colorblind. But in a wheelchair, there are assumptions that we can make from what we can see.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. Now, just to put that into a picture, because some people think about things in this way, seeing 7% or roughly 7% of the population of the disabled or impaired population have visible impairments. What does that leave us with? I'm no mathematician, but it's more than 90% who don't have something that you can observe or that is visible. So that means if we are only focusing on the easily identifiable impairments and disabilities, then we are leaving a lot of people out. And that's going to be on a spectrum as well, because some of them may be able to make do. But there are others who are just not going to be able to consume our content or our platform or whatever it is we're deploying and expecting everybody to be able to see evenly.
Yeah,
so this
definitely.
is where we get into a little bit of this self-serving bit of this, but we can only talk from experience and about how OpenLMS deals with accessibility. So as most people would probably know, and we don't keep it a secret, our product is based on Moodle. And Moodle has done some major work, over the years, but especially more recently around usability. And usability often translates into accessibility. But in this case, the focus has been on accessibility as well as usability. So the statement from Moodle, which we definitely stand behind, is that accessibility is not a state. It's a process of continuous improvement in response to our users and the wider technical environment. So it might not be apparent, but I've been around for a little while. It's probably apparent. I've been on this earth for a long time, and I've been in the L&D space for a long time. And I was working in digital back when digital was just, it'll never catch on. And when we used to build things in Flash, for example, we couldn't make it accessible. It was just not possible. And when we used to build online stuff, it was almost impossible. It was always secondary. It was the next thing that you did when you couldn't get into a classroom. It was always the poor cousin, for the poor guy who's stationed out in some weird place that you couldn't get a teacher to, or they couldn't fly in, or whatever it was. But we don't have that excuse now. Technology has moved on, and with HTML5 and things like that, and its compatibility with screen readers being able to read logical code, we don't have too many excuses to not build really navigable, usable, accessible content. And yeah, I don't want to jump the gun too much, but there are plenty of standards out there as well that you can use to apply that. No, because I was going somewhere else with it about so I'll do the opinions at the end. But WCAG, which is a really nice word, but the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, we apply this when it comes to online learning because it does apply. If it was mainly set up for websites and the navigation of websites, but if you apply the same principles of a user experience, user interface, design, and nice structured coding to your e-learning, we can provide you with an LMS that has been through a lot of testing and a lot of rigorous development around accessibility with an end game that is to make it more accessible. But we need to make sure that our clients and our audience and even just our community members are also aware that just because we've given you an accessible platform doesn't mean what you serve up to your own users will be accessible. So,
Correct.
And feel free to throw in some comments or anything there, but the content doesn't automatically become accessible just because you're in an accessible platform. So WCAG's great, and Moodle 4.x, which most people are on now, and if any of you are not on it yet, you've probably spoken to one of us about getting onto the latest versions of Moodle at some point in the near future. WCAG 2.1 AA certified. What does that all mean? It just means that the majority of people with an impairment or a disability that relates to how they access online digital content, so not the built environment, should be able to, with minimum effort, independently access our content. I know there's a lot of caveats there, but you can't cover 100%. It won't work. There is a AAA as well, but it is very hard to reach with digital. AAA tends to be quite a high bar to reach. AA is definitely going to meet the requirements of, say, universities. Universities usually have AA as a requirement for their content, for their platforms, built environments, and things like that. It's usually in that similar vein. And this, again, more caveats, but actually, could you go back? Because there's a caveat there that I think is important. It does relate to the Boost theme, which is what Moodle rolls out of the box with, and we also have a variation of the Boost theme, but it's a Boost variation that adheres to these standards. So that is where we conform with the global web standards. But you can also make it less compatible with these standards if you use colors that don't contrast properly in your branding and things like that. So we are here, though, to talk to about that kind of thing. And we do have tools that can be applied to check whether your content ticks the accessibility boxes. And VPAT. VPAT's an interesting one. I thought we made it up when I first heard it, to be quite frank.
So did I, actually.
Yeah. Well, apparently the US military, parts of the US military use it as well. And I think this is great because it goes hand in hand with the open source ethos that we all subscribe to. It's a voluntary product accessibility template. Now, when an industry can monitor itself and do it up to a standard, I think that is the best place to be. Because when you're monitored from outside, they're going to apply a standard that is maybe applicable to that guy over there, but not to you and your audience and so on. But if you can do your own product accessibility and it meets the standards that you think your clients need, then you can up that, down that, or whatever the next time you do your accessibility checklists. So we do this for our EDU and Snap theme because although it's still built on Moodle, we've built extra stuff on top. So we want to make sure that not only the WCAG stuff is applied, but whatever we've made changes to is also assessed for accessibility. So we take it upon ourselves to do those audits. And I think that's it's a good thing that we've taken on. But also, why wouldn't we want more people to be able to use our platform independently, without having to get extra help? Because we're helping the clients out there that buy the platform, but we're also helping the people at the end of the day. And we may be a little bit romantic or maybe sound a little bit sappy, but we do believe in creating a level playing field. It's not just for sales. If someone says to me, I can't use your platform, I want to know why and I want to delve into it. When we do things like this, we are making sure that we're adhering to these standards.
And I think if we're making it accessible and easy for everyone to use and be able to, complete studies successfully, they're going to want to keep coming back as well.
So partly altruistic and partly selfish, but I think the altruism is definitely the driver, and we benefit from it as well. Yeah.
So if we talk about some of the accessibility features we have available, we have a lot.
There's a lot. I mean, it's hard to even go into detail on all of them because it won't all apply. But let's just say that Moodle has partnered with Brickfield. So and Brickfield has multiple different levels of service. You can pay for Brickfield, but there's a free accessibility checker. Build some content in your platform, brand it up, check, and it will give you a little list of the things that don't stand up. I mean, if you're not comfortable necessarily looking at it or getting someone to test it, you can do these accessibility checkers. And just remembering in many industries, accessibility is becoming a focus, but the guidelines around how each of those industries wants you to do it is not necessarily clear. So if you at least have a baseline that is based on these WCAG and these various other tests, you can serve up something that has passed at least a few hurdles for accessibility. And I will put in another caveat here too. As soon as you start building content in a third-party tool, like a SCORM, a rapid development tool and so on, you do need to think about those as you're building them as well. Because just putting them into the LMS doesn't make them accessible, and the LMS can't necessarily access the closed box of what SCORM is rendering when the SCORM player starts it up. But if you're building content directly into the LMS, this is where the checkers are the most valuable. So if you're building, using Moodle activities, H5P, and various other things like that. I think one of the things that we often forget when it comes to the observable is people with motor issues and even preferences. The ability to be able to tab through the code or tab through the screens in the platform. I think it took a long time for websites to even get to that point, because when you're coding, you're not thinking about how will somebody access this in logical form. So they build it in ways where when you tab, you'll go to different parts of the screen in random order. When you're building accessible content using at a code level, you're building things so that the tabs move in a logical order. And that also tells you that a screen reader will read things in a logical order. And that's what we can, confidently say about what our LMS is able to do, the tab ability. And I wear glasses, but that's my only main impairment. But I did used to run test scripts in LMSs and eLearning and made sure that my developers were building things in logical order, because we did have, at some of the organizations I've worked at, that tabbing was using a keyboard to navigate through eLearning was our main requirement when it came to accessibility. So we didn't do everything when it came to accessibility, but that was one that we did do.
So if we move on to talk about, there's one like really big feature which gets a lot of people, but I think is really important. It's something super simple that we can all do, which is this idea of alternative text on images. Now this is just a screenshot of what it looks like in the Moodle LMS, just to give you a bit of an idea. But it's something that's a real easy win for people, as long as we just don't go and tick and say every image is decorative. That's a good win.
Which does happen. So that's why we mention it, because it comes up a lot. But this has been a feature for a very long time, and it has been underutilized. But if you think about somebody tabbing through a course, or someone using a screen reader more specifically, if they get to a point that adds context, so an image that adds an awful lot of context to the course, and you're referring to it in a block of text, describe the image. It's as simple as that. And describe it in a succinct way. Don't need to describe it down to the blade of grass in a field or anything like that, but describe the context of what it is you're trying to get across. Because someone with sight impairment, they have imagination, they've had to work on it. So they know how to form a picture in their minds if you can describe what it is you're trying to get to. Don't just say a picture of a tree. If you're doing something on botany or something like that, maybe you should mention what kind of tree and what circumstance it's in, and whether it's in drought, things like that, because it's all about context.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do want to include short descriptions and any text that's in the image. I think this is really important, right? If we can put the text in the actual text box or not actually in the image, that's a better option. We don't necessarily want to have images with text in them, but if there is text in the image, make sure it's in the alternative text as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know, well, hopefully we know by now, but if you haven't, you'll learn that putting text in an image sometimes doesn't work very well if your user is using a different kind of device or a low quality internet connection. It might not render the image in a way that makes it clear what it is it's saying. And unless you're using very high contrast text, it's also very difficult to read. But it goes without saying that a screen reader won't read it anyway, because if it's part of a JPEG or a PNG, it's actually been pressed into and flattened out into the image. It's no longer text, it's just an image of text. So there's a lot of reasons not to use text in an image, but if you have to, also put it into the description or the alt text.
Yes. So things that we shouldn't do with alternative text. Image of. I mean, we know it's an image already, so we don't need to include image of or picture of.
Yep. Think about your audience, really. Do they need to know that it's an image of? The screen reader is going to know that it's an image of. And if it's part of the context of what it is you're teaching, it's descriptive anyway. The image is supposed to, what was it? A picture paints 1,000 words. Use the words, not thousands of them, though. Be succinct. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of related as well, captions. So the words that sit underneath the image or above the image, depending on where you place them, can be really useful as well.
And I had a little brainwave while I was having my lunch. I'm in Singapore, by the way, so I've been eating a lot. But where alt text provides the context to those who can't see the image, the captions provide further context to people who can but may not get the full understanding of what it is you're trying to convey.
Yeah.
And I think captions are going to be different depending on how you do things. So one image may have different captions depending on the context that you're putting it into. And if we go to the image that we're talking about here, now, if I was doing a photography or talking about a photography course, my caption would be drawing attention to the lighting and the composition and the camera phone itself and things like that. But if it's about diversity, it might be about the ethnicity of the people in the image. Or if it's about, built environments, it could be something about cities and society and things like that. So it really does come down to what it is you're trying to convey. An image can have many different captions that bring context based on where you're putting that image.
Yeah.
And sorry, that was without notice, Jazz, because I was thinking of that just before.
That's fine. So yeah, so if you have thoughts, like this is just a caption that we came up with for this image, but if anyone who's listening, if you have ideas of what could also be, alternative text or a caption for this, would be really interested on what your take is as well.
I mean, if you're selling phones, it might be focusing on the brand of the phone,
Yeah,
how it picks up images
yeah,
in high sunlight areas or in natural
yeah.
light. So the
Doing one
context,
of those courses on how to take the best selfie and the best photos with the smartphone.
yeah. I mean, it's a great photo, actually, the way that it is composed. So, it's probably a good example. But yeah, enough about that. Summarizing. When we're in a classroom, we can summarize for a lot of different reasons. So, I often used to summarize towards the end of a topic rather than at the end of the day to make sure that people were understanding what was going on. But often I would stop and summarize when I could see that there were people who weren't quite understanding because I could see the room and I could understand. So it's the where have we been? It's the rear view mirror. Because people can't put their hand up in a digital environment when you're doing learning activities and so on, summarizing and filling in maybe the gaps. And this is where you have to stand in someone else's shoes. So it doesn't take a cognitive impairment to not understand a topic. But often that is the case. A cognitive impairment, maybe it has to do with their attention span or just certain concepts need to be repeated multiple times or something like that, or a learning disability of some kind that, means that repeating, they're still in the class for the right reasons, but repeating it in the right way and rephrasing it and all that kind of thing is filling in the gaps. And the summary isn't, here's exactly what we spoke about in subheadings. It's, restating things. And I know it sounds really obvious, and those of you who are teachers or learning designers probably do it all the time, but not everybody who delivers this kind of stuff online has the luxury of that kind of experience. They're trying to get a concept across and may not have had the fortune of standing in a classroom and seeing that, hey, I'm seeing 10 different levels of understanding here. How can I summarize it for the lowest common denominator without making people feel like I'm repeating myself? And it's a skill, but it's very doable. And with AI and stuff, you can do lots of things around things anyway. And I wrote, this doesn't just apply to accessibility. This is for anybody in a learning environment. But for accessibility in particular, we do need to think about people who may not be catching on as quickly as others. And that's one of those less visible and probably not even put their hand up. They're not even going to put their hand up at the end that I didn't understand because they don't want to stand out. And I've had people like that. They're allowed to be there too. We just need to teach properly and thoroughly and summarize and all that kind of thing.
Definitely.
And this one, maybe, do you want to talk through this one, Jazz? Because I heard you talking about this one and you seem to have a bit of a feeling or a vibe for this one.
Sure. I mean, I think language is important and how we talk to people is important in the way that we frame the things that we say. So if we look at this slide, when we're talking about people, we're talking about them as a disabled person, a blind person, a deaf person. We're putting the disability or the impairment first and forgetting that they are actually a person as well. And that's what we need to keep first and foremost, is that all of these people that we're working with and that we're trying to educate, they are people. They are not defined by the disability or by being blind or deaf. They are people. And so we need to think about them first.
Yeah, for sure. And this isn't about having to write it down in every course that this is for a person with a disability. This is about how we think about them. They're a person first, and then there may be something that we need to cater to or maybe aggregate. So we might be able to cater to multiple different impairments or disabilities by doing something pretty straightforward and simple to get the message across. But it's just a frame of mind, because this to me speaks to that traditional way of doing L&D, which we've all been doing for a very long time, which is we'll build something that we can do quickly and efficiently. And if somebody has an issue with it, we'll create a reasonable adjustment. And in some work environments I've been, the reasonable adjustment has been printing out the e-learning or sitting in a classroom and talking through it so they can do the quiz or the test. Now that's expensive. When you think you can cater to that in the original piece and have more people be able to access it and have less need for reasonable adjustment, you're not just talking to being good citizens of the world, you're also talking about being good consumers of budget and efficient users of budget. So you can still look at this with the brutal reality of finance and budgets, and there are efficiencies that can be created, even if accessibility isn't seen as one of the main pillars of your organization or something like that. There is an efficiency, there's a return on investment to doing things in a way that is thinking about these people first, and then whatever impairment they have second, and building that into the design process.
I think actually that ties back into the idea of zone of normal. As cringeworthy as that term might be, like, I can't help but think that we need to change what our idea of normal is. And like one example of that for me is being on the train and hearing people listen to their videos on speaker really loudly. If they had access to captioning on those videos, might not need to have the sound on. So that can be part of our new normal, or what should be normal anyway, but it's also helping people who might be hard of hearing, or who might have English as a second language, or maybe the person who's presenting has a heavy English accent, like from some places in Scotland, is going to be hard for us to understand what they're saying. So captioning can really help in a number of different circumstances. So it needs to become part of our normal.
Absolutely. And I just thinking back to, I used to consume a lot of video learning content on public transport because I had a 1.5 hour commute. And I would wear headphones, but trains and trams are, in Melbourne in particular, if those of you who know it, even in Sydney and Brisbane and everywhere else, they're noisy, especially in peak hour. So I would often read the captions to help me, get the message, especially going through a tunnel or something like that, all the and the announcements. So accessibility can help everybody, or what if you had an eye operation or something like that, and you wanted the alt text with a screen reader and things like that. So you've got to think about all of those fringe cases that can benefit from just making content more accessible, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And remembering the zone of normal is very subjective. So your normal is not my normal. There could be an organization that has hired a lot of people with certain impairments or something, and they do cater to it, and that's their normal.
That's true.
Don't have an issue,
Absolutely.
I worked with an organization not all that long ago who were hiring people from a school that was teaching people mainly with autism spectrum disorder and things like that. So they were a little bit different. They did synthesize information differently, and that was an awesome challenge for me to rebuild the compliance content for that organization, to not only cater to everybody in the organization who was from the traditional recruitment pathway, but also for this new group without ruining doubling up my budget. So building something that catered to the cognitive disadvantage, perhaps, or impairment that people had.
I think that ties really nicely in with this point about creating multiple pathways. It helps everyone.
And this sounds really, really mind-boggling and intimidating. And we're not talking about branching pathways so that you end up with 1,000 outcomes. This is more about, you can start low with this, right? Captions and transcripts is a good phase one, and it will kick goals. People will love it. There are people out there who don't want to watch videos, and they're not people with a sight impairment or hearing impairment. They're people who prefer to read than watch someone talking.
I mean, you give me a 50-minute video and I'm probably going to be like playing a game on my phone, like Candy Crush or something, and not listening to the video.
Precisely. Although we need to talk about that, Jess. Don't worry, we're here to help. But it's true, there are multiple ways of doing doing these things. Like I've always thought of transcripts and videos as being the perfect example of this. And if you're already doing it, fantastic. What's the next thing you can do? So, there's probably a million different things that you could do. I actually like the idea of doing podcasts, just doing an audio only stream of things as well, and just breaking up the content. Your summary might be in a different format that is consumed differently.
Yeah.
Summary content might be in a different format, and the summary is nice and concise or bookmarked or something like that. So there are various different ways, and it is going to depend on the kind of content you're delivering as well. Because if you're doing a graphic design course, it's not going to be all text. And similarly, if it's heavy science, there's going to have to be maths in it. So there are certain things that are very stuck within the subject matter, but there are always a couple of different ways to get information across that can knock off a few of those different barriers that are there in our more traditional one path kind of solution.
Yeah. So side note, let us know in the comments if you want us to start up a podcast.
Yeah, I love podcasts.
We are coming to the end, I promise.
Yeah, we're getting there.
More slides that we need to get through.
Actually, this is it. I wanted to finish on this. My favorite cliche. Normally, I see these accessibility discussions starting with this, but I think it's almost talking down to the audience. But when we get to the end, it's easier to give this a bit of context. And I do think that good design is accessible. I don't know how else to say it. We've been saying it for a long time in the industry, and it's still subjective though. So I can build something that looks amazing, doesn't mean it's well designed. And I have worked with graphic designers who build stuff that just knocks me out. And then I'm like, sorry, but we're going to have to change the color contrast in there. They're like, oh, but it'll ruin it. And it's like, yeah, but I've got a whole bunch of people who won't be able to use this content. And
I feel like that's a common argument with a lot of marketing teams and companies. They want it to look really flash and amazing, but you're just like, it hurts my eyes when it's that bright.
Correct. Or even fonts. So I did work in learning and development at Australia Post at one time as a consultant, and I went to marketing and put forward the case that the font that we were using did not translate well to digital. It wasn't readable. And I won. They gave me a secondary alternative font because the case was compelling. And Australia Post has a very interesting recruitment policy. So you could draw it back to the recruitment policy, the level playing field. L&D wasn't held to the same level at that point. But afterwards, I believe it has been, because we were being forced to use the red, white, and black branding in everything. So everything has changed a bit now. And the red, white, and black did not go well on pages in digital. So we were able to get the font changed and change the color spectrum to still complement the brand, but also be accessible. And that is often a challenge that I've seen in organizations. Sometimes the color palette is the main thing holding a piece of content back. And I know at a big corporate, which I won't name, but the reasonable adjustment I had to make was for colorblind people, because the colors weren't high contrast enough and you couldn't see right, wrong, and you couldn't see the iconography properly because of the color scheme that had been used. It was dead on brand. It looked perfect to me. But when putting it through that accessibility lens, it was not comprehensible at all for someone with blue-green colorblind. So, and we had reasonable adjustment. And guess what? We had lots of people with blue-green. So we had to run classroom versions of eLearning. Which just confounds me that was allowed to happen.
Goes back to the cliche, good design is accessible.
Exactly. And I think most marketing people know this these days, because a lot of them have come through recently through marketing and even workshops, and going back to for re-education around UX and UI and things like that. These things do come up in those masterclasses and workshops and, professional development and things like that. And just drawing things back to that value and to that accessibility and that level playing field. And if you have to, bring it back to PR because, PR sort of stings right to the top of the organization. So if you can't get them on anything else, PR is probably the good last resort.
Definitely.
Yeah. Look, as you could tell, we could probably talk about this when you start drilling down into bits of content. We could pull up a bit of SCORM content, and I can show you all the things that are wrong with it, and how to fix them if we can. But we could also build something built into Moodle that uses all the right tools, but with all the wrong colors. So it does come down to the circumstances and the filter that you apply, and the checks that you do. So the VPAT stuff and looking at the WCAG requirements and things like that are an excellent first stop. You won't meet all of them 100%. Nobody does, but just having them in your mind while you're designing, while you're even conceiving of the content. Best time to think about it is before you build. So, or when you're about to refresh the content as well. But from what you've probably heard here, from my experience as well, you often have to have a lot of people in the room to get some decisions made, because you can't just change a color palette. You can't just change a design tool. You can't just change the content, because subject matter experts came up with the terminology. Can you make this simpler, please? Because I have people who need the language to be simpler or more inclusive or whatever it might be. So it's not our job to change the content words, but how it gets deployed and who we get to review it and so on is certainly in our purview.
So on that note, if you have any questions, drop them into the chat. But if not, we hope you've enjoyed today's session and liked the information that James and I have presented. Mostly James, thank you. We will send around an email afterwards as well, and provide the slides for your reference. I haven't seen any questions.
Not to forget that our knowledge base has some great articles on accessibility, and you'll see that there is a bit of passion around the place around accessibility too, because we have some interesting tool sets and a few good links to things like VPAT templates and so on as well, and WCAG guidelines and things like that. So, we're here to reach out to as well. So just let your account manager know, and we can get in touch, whether it's me in adoption, whether it's Jazz, whether it's Susie. We're here to help. We don't want you to have inaccessible content in our awesome accessible platform.
Absolutely.
We want to help out wherever we can.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to catch you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.